So we titled today's talk, Neimark and Andrew Atwood talk about models. And in part, well, two different things kind of came up about it. We talk about models today because that's pretty much what we make. We haven't really built buildings yet. So we build models that come as close as possible to buildings. But also the models that you see in the exhibition today, the three under consideration, the kind of unfolded Mackie model, all the way to the right in the corner, in the center, the one house model, the one room house model, and to the left, the Shanghai house Duchamp model. Those are the most recent work, and we wanted to introduce those three projects by showing you a couple of examples of some of the earlier work to kind of get into the way in which the concept of the studio is organized. So the three projects that we should probably start with. Zopol was the first one that we did together as a collaboration in 2011, and it took a very simple idea of the figure ground as a starting point for a drawing to produce a figure ground of a new urban plan. And these are the models that came out of that projection. And one thing that we took from it was that a simple figure ground drawing could be juxtaposed with an instrument of model making. So in this case, the foam cutter, which cuts with a wire through a block of foam, directly corresponded to the drawing technique that was quite conventional, a simple black and white plan. The Pinterest headquarters, which was a collaboration between our office and all of the above, took as a kind of starting point for paintings by Malevich and did another kind of extrusion where we produced a series of monumental furniture parts for the headquarters in San Francisco, and each one understood the figure ground in a different way. When these parts were superimposed and built one on top of the other, in reviewing the photographs, we realized there was no way to really understand how this project understood the section through the warehouse. So the closest that it got was probably this photograph where you see the projection of two of these white on white constructs, one on top of the other. And we recognized the fact that in this case, we had to build the models after the fact. So after the Pinterest headquarters were already built, we had to then again build the models. And in this case, the model, and this kind of is where our interest comes in very clearly. The model is actually built after the fact of the built project in reality. And so the model begins to disclose ideas that maybe weren't clear, weren't present in the work as such. So in this case, you're looking at a kind of composite image. So not only was kind of the model the final project, let's say, so in this case, the image of the model is the final project. So it's important to kind of maybe point out that you're looking at two photographs that are set up from two cameras looking at one vanishing point, but one is a kind of bird's eye view and one is a worm's eye view of the same model. So this image doesn't exist in real world. It's a kind of construction. And for us, it represented something akin to a rendering, something that is an image drawn from a digital model, not a physical one. So, and then the third kind of introductory project that sets up some of these ideas was the possible table. So in this case, the idea of a kind of model of a regular IKEA table projected against the corner, we thought to reverse this natural, let's say, lineage of things, of like building things according to drawings. In this case, we built the table according to the images, and this is what it became. It's a kind of table that registers the fact that it's sitting in a corner, and so it had to have this little IKEA door stopper to hold it in place. But again, if you look at the background of this table, it's kind of odd in the way in which it doesn't quite portray the way in which it was rendered. And so, of course, after building the actual table, we had to make images of the table. So again, these kind of things that we hold quite clear in our minds, the drawing that precedes, let's say, the rendering that precedes the building, in this case is reversed once again. And so the model is photographed against the context of what the rendering would have held, right? So the corner is literally modeled into this image yet again. And so of course, it kind of offsets the gravity of the situation, and everything is understood in relationship to the background of the image as opposed to the kind of background of the floor. At that time, so we're making these models, and they were very self-referential, and these things were quite private. So let's say we were talking to each other about how excited we were to move between drawings, models, and images, and we talked to our students about these things because, of course, we're both teaching and in kind of thinking about the way in which we teach, the way in which we make models, was extremely important to the practice. So these things were reciprocal between what we were doing together and what we were doing with our students. But at the time, we received an email from Matthew Hunter, a colleague at McGill, with the subject modeling questionnaire. And he asked us a series of questions about the models to make us perhaps more kind of conscious, or this email, this questionnaire that we had to fill out, made us think very, very, very critically about our own work. And we recognized at this point that the idea of the model is not a private idea. It's not something that happens in the office between two collaborators, but the model is actually a kind of act of public display, let's say, something that we can share with others, right? And not only that, the model becomes something that transcends our own discipline. So we always thought of models as architectural models, but in fact there are scientific models, there are mathematical models, and they all bear a similarity in that they represent, they're the way in which we represent the world to ourselves. So in that way, they produce a kind of public conversation within these different discourses. So going public with that idea, we looked at a couple of other ways in which, or a couple of canonical ways in which images of models are displayed. And this one is of Michelangelo presenting the model of St. Peter's to the Pope. And of course, well, we all recognize the architect. He's dressed in black. Already, this is an image from the 17th century, but this is a 15, representing something that happened in the, let's say, in the 15th century. The Pope in white, the model, of course, white, lit beautifully. And the model in this case, you can see it kind of hidden, not revealed behind one of the admirers. This model is kind of, let's say, life-size. Not the size of the building, but the size of the people surrounding it. So it's one of the participants in the conversation. And in this case, of course, Michelangelo is pointing at the model. The model is his creation. It is also in his image, as it were. So it becomes a kind of public display of his authorship and the transmittal of the authenticity of his kind of persona as an architect to the Pope. We don't have a Pope as a client. This is like an audience of one, an important audience of one. What we realized is today's kind of audience has changed, has shifted. So by the way, let me see. This model is a wooden model that's hinged and can open, so you can reveal the interior. Another hinged model is the Peppa Pig Playhouse, which is here presented by Disney Collector on YouTube. 7 million views. We aspire to that, but okay. So we watch these movies endlessly because they represent our kind of contemporary public space, right? We have an audience of 7 or 8. Right now, it's amazing to see you all here. This is a first in a way. But so this is our image of kind of our model. Let's say the architect again dressed in black, as he should be, and it's Andrew. The model lit beautifully with white in the middle, almost displayed as a corpse. And this is going straight to his Instagram, and like 7 people are going to say like, and that's basically our world.
Growing, though, growing.
Growing.
Yes.
And this is one of the models in the space. By the way, this is the MAK project, Paranormal Panorama, and this is the first of 3 that we'll actually talk in more detail. And I'll kind of start to introduce it, and then Andrew will pick it up. The model that you see in the space, as you can imagine, was built after the fact. We built this installation for a Austrian filmmaker, Constanze Room, and inside of the white box there is a temporary screening room for her film called Rehearsal. You'll notice, if you look kind of carefully at the screen, that along the walls there is a rendering of a mountain projected onto the interior. So that's something that will become important later on. But in our conversations with Constanze Room, we kind of thought about it as a collaboration rather than, let's say, pure provision of a service as architects. We exchanged a couple of images with one another. On the left is the still shot from her film called Rehearsal, where one of the characters is about to die inside of a crevice on one of the Swiss mountains that she's hiking on. And on the right was an image that we were working with by a photograph of an atelier where Viollet Le Duc worked, also in Lausanne near the Swiss Alps. And you'll see that there is a projection of a mountain on the interior of his office. Somehow these two photographs really collided, in two emails that moved from us to her and Constanze back to us. So we decided to produce this installation around these images. And for us, the work of Viollet Le Duc was really important at the time because we were really interested in trying to understand how to transition from rendering digitally into the physical space of constructed interiors. So in this case, literally thinking about how a rendering can be understood through the medium of paint. And so, of course, he already did that. So here we see on the top the panorama of Mont Blanc. And this is something that he would have produced with a camera lucida, looking at the 360-degree view of the entire mountain by kind of shifting this instrument and projecting it onto his drawing plane. And then you'll see on the bottom, this image is projected again into the domestic interior. So what you're looking at on the bottom is a kind of unrolled elevation of the interior of that salon. And two things that are really important to us in this image is that you'll see up here and over here two seams in the panorama. So from far away it looks like a continuous landscape, but up close there are two seams, and those seams correspond to the two corners of the room. So that's where the drawing would fold into the space. The other thing that you'll see are the three rectangles, which kind of erase the drawing. Those are standing in for the two doors of the room and the fireplace. And each one corresponds to a peak in the mountaintop. Right? So like the largest peak of Mont Blanc is against the main door of the salon. There's a smaller peak on the kind of private side of the room, and there's another peak on the fireplace. And all three correspond to a vanishing point. So it's a kind of composite of a panoramic image. And those kinds of details became really important. So this is a photograph of the interior of that space. The way in which this rendering enters the architectural interior is really fascinating. And if you look at some of these details, you'll see that everything is kind of carefully considered. So for example, some of the interior cladding of stone literally takes the stone of the painting and projects it into the space of the room. Or the way in which the ceiling is painted, that paint is as light as the sky of the panorama itself. So this is a black and white photograph, but it would have been a very colored space. And in our case, we wanted to think about how we don't work with camera lucidas anymore, but we work with digital models mostly. We wanted to see how the translation of a digital model could enter, again, an architectural interior, and kind of how we might domesticate this wild landscape. In this case, as a kind of slit scan view, so a slit scan is something that produces, again, one-point perspectives, but each one the width of 1 pixel, something that combines into, again, a kind of panoramic space. And here you see it unrolled in such a way that, again, you see kind of where the doors are for the installation and how it begins to come together. There are a couple of other architectural details that enter the space beyond the medium of paint, which have to do with thinking about the gallery as something that could take on a kind of domestic appearance. So galleries are usually white, without detail, without molding. A lot of detail goes into making them kind of mute. And we thought that that was a good opportunity to add detail back to it. Let's say kind of ornamental molding, ornamental type of light switches, vents, etc. So you see some of these, if you follow a light switch up through the conduit, it connects to another light switch. We're very careful to point out to the audience that these are representational devices. They're not actually functioning as things that turn on and off lights. The plan of the space would fold that wall into something that produced the interior of the room where the film could take place. So as a result, the model itself had to be something that for us revealed to the audience how it was designed, right? So like it's a model that is unrolled first, presented in its unrolled state, let's say, to reflect the panorama and the way in which it was understood in the computer, and then rolled back physically through its hinged kind of corners into the model that you see in the gallery today, kind of half folded, half folded. So this is when it's folded completely back into space.
Okay. As Anna mentioned, one of the ambitions for this project was probably the construction of this particular image, which is the room that when it's folded up that you can see in the plan. And there's a number of things that are important about this, and I'm going to unpack a little bit of them and talk about how they've influenced some of the ways we think about, let's say, the relationship between models and images and renderings and photographs. So just to sort of remember this image as we move forward. The image, as a construction, has a precedent, or has two precedents actually, in a model, or again, two models that are a continuing source of fascination for us and a kind of, I'll even say it, inspiration. So this is the Cornell Box, and for those of you who don't know it, I'll explain very quickly. In the early 1980s, when the sort of problem of photorealistic rendering was, the computers were fast enough and we had a handle enough on the processes, they began to develop testing devices, models to test essentially the fidelity of one image to the other. And so they would build one model, an actual physical model, which is the image on the left, and then they would produce a digital rendering of that same thing inside a computer on the right, and they would use those things to compare one to the other. So this is actually the way in which they compared them. A guy would sit there and they would have to be projected to a screen, obviously, so it could be equal, and a guy would look back and forth to be able to distinguish what looked more real and what didn't. And it really sort of pulls apart something that I think we still, as architects, think of as different, a photograph and an image. And in the way in which these things begin to be, let's say, composited on top of each other to compare, let's say, the fidelity of one image to the other, in kind of a way, that's what we were trying to do. So the way in which we would think about a kind of room or a photograph as a kind of method to render a mountain, let's say. So the conventions of sort of domestic interiors and paint, and how we would produce a photograph of that thing that was also a kind of projection of a rendering simultaneously. So we had to do a little bit of research about what were the sort of, outside of computer graphics, let's say outside of art, what were the kind of tools of an architect to produce a kind of mashup like this? How would we use a room to render, let's say, a mountain? And so, wow, this is even lighter than normal. On the left is Malaysia's white on white. This was a gallery interior after all, so while we did try to kind of add at least some sort of warmth of home, it still needed to be a white room. So what we wanted to do to make this thing, we decided we would have to use paint, obviously, as a kind of tool of architects, or at least a material of architecture, domestic interior paint, and how we would use white paint specifically, and how we would specify it to produce a rendering of a mountain. So we went around to all of the hardware stores in Los Angeles and asked them for their base white. And then we painted a series of tests. This is it on the right. And we could see how drastically different, in fact, those base whites actually were, and how we could construct, again, an image of a mountain using a gallery white paint, a kind of blank white paint. So this is the test. Maybe it's clearer for you. I don't think so. You can see something kind of on the upper right. But so the problem, one sort of solving, or let's say separating out the paintings, is one thing. The kind of a larger problem is how to produce a set of instructions so that someone, a painter, a house painter, could actually produce this this image. I had to be sort of careful in the story I tell, because we like to tell people that sort of professional house painters painted. Actually, Ryan Work painted it, who's sitting in the audience. But let's just say that she was sort of performing the act of a painter. And the tool for that, at least one of the tools, is the spec book. So we, in sort of our research, looking at the way in which architects spec paint and how in which they create the instructions to give to, one, cover themselves, for litigious reasons, but also to sort of give a set of instructions that operate in some cases outside of drawings, but how they use text to kind of tell a story. So the spec book really is the kind of text that architects write, and this is our attempt at a kind of spec book that, as it turns out, Ryan had to decipher so that she could actually produce a painting, but the idea being that a domestic painter would do it. So you can see on the left, these are the different paints, which are all just basically the whitest paints we could find to satisfy, let's say, the gallery. And then these are the different sets of instructions that we had to use with the sort of orientation, the masking tape, and again, sort of taking into account the kind of mundane materials of something like painting a domestic interior. So these are the instructions. There was a lot more of these. I don't know how much she actually read them, but the hope is that she did. And this is another one of those images. And so when we begin to think about this thing not as a room that we designed necessarily to hold, let's say, an opening or a screening, but actually something that's been built so that we could take this photograph, other things begin to sort of participate in the construction of the image. So in the same way that Violet did, there are other things that begin to frame and support the kind of image. So the conduit in this case, and the light switches, and even the door and the molding, all of these things don't necessarily become so much a part of, let's say, the model and the way in which you describe this, but it's part of the model that it is projected to produce an image like this. So it gets really, really funny, these kind of games that we play when we start to look at this. So this is the model that is out in the gallery, and it was built, like a lot of our models, after we built this thing. And the model itself has its own kind of details. And so if we were to build the room so that we could produce a painting, which would then be thought of as a rendering, so that we need to produce another model, which would be unfolded to look like another drawing, you get something like this. And you can begin to see some of the strange things that start to happen in this model. One, we wanted to unroll. We didn't build the model. We had someone else do it, Alex and Brooke. They are very good at these things. But you can begin to see some of the strange details. So the conduit has to sort of navigate what ultimately wants to unfold, and you can begin to see the very strange sort of mitering details that happen in basswood at the top, so this thing can unroll. You guys can enjoy this in the gallery if you like. There's a video that specifically focuses for about 5 seconds just on the top of this thing, so it's easier to see. So in building these things and building this model of something like this, so this sort of all exists comfortably in the scale of a domestic interior. The paint, the conduit, these are all things that we can go and either buy or make to the scale of a model, the doorknobs even. But it gets to be funny when we start to think about actually the scale of paint. So we can go to dollhouse stores and Barbie stores and buy the scale versions of these things. You know, you can actually go buy scale molding and little hinges and little doorknobs, and they are cute. I'm finally coming to terms with that term. Paint's not actually. So can't really see this, but paint doesn't actually scale so well. You can go buy scale lumber. You can go buy scale doorknobs. You can't buy small paint. Paint just comes in its size, and when you brush it on a little vent, if it's a normal size vent, it looks, well, normal, right? Right. Here, it begins to get kind of messy, and it begins to kind of corrode. And so when we go to paint, let's say, the painting on the wall, in this case, it's printed. What does this kind of scale of paint happen when we actually print it? It becomes an image. We have to render it as the thickness of the real full-scale paint on the model, so you can see a kind of fake drop shadow. So these are the things where the sort of scale of paint is then projected on the image, which is then printed on the wall, which is then built and constructed. Yeah. These are the things that we get excited about. Maybe it's not such a public conversation. As a kind of segue into the next project, in a lot of these things, there's a lot of different stuff that's going on in these in terms of the things we talk about. The unrolled elevation was a big part of them, and I think David's here, but I think David made this drawing. But so this is the unrolled elevation, but the sort of question came, like, what would happen if we actually unrolled the entire thing? And that was the starting point for the next project that I'll talk about again briefly, and this is the second project that's out in the lobby, the one-room house, or one-room house for Maria, or Maria's house.
Or Tumbleweed House.
Right, and their Tumbleweed House. And this house is basically something that was conceived of as a kind of developed surface drawing, and it's because of this little thing right here, which is a Murphy bed, which I'll talk about in a second. So, sorry, I'm getting a little excited with the mouse. So a lot of us are familiar with these drawings. These are developed surface drawings, which were in some cases made famous, at least in architecture, in Robin Evans' article, The Developed Surface. And I just show them one to sort of reference the sort of points that we've come from, but I'll call attention to the sort of strange furniture in the way at which it, in the drawing at least, deals with the surface of the wall. This is the plan. It's one room, and then this is actually this is phase 2, the bathroom, which will happen maybe in a year. It actually is just a bedroom, kind of detached bedroom for Maria's mother. And this is the section. And then here is the Murphy bed. So this is a model of the Murphy bed. Murphy beds are sort of strange things, and in a way they begin to operate on hinges and in a kind of direct way, in the way that a developed surface drawing might. And so we use this in 2 different ways. One is, again, the sort of strange way in which it has to fold, and then it has 2 different types of relationships with the walls and the wall and the floor. So this is another drawing from the same article, which shows the problem even more. So it's very difficult in some cases to figure out exactly which surface this chair belongs to. It's a kind of axon, it's a kind of elevation oblique, but it's sitting on the floor, so it has some, let's say, fidelity to the wall, but it also is on the floor, so it's confused. And these kind of confusions are things that we like to get creative with. And so a kind of offshoot of this is our own kind of our desire to put our own kind of confused love seat inside of this house. So this is the couch on couch, which is a rendering of a couch that's then been projected on top of itself again, producing the couch on couch. And so you can see quickly that this is, again, a kind of impossible object. It doesn't necessarily reconcile itself to a single model that's in a computer. You can't open this in Rhino and turn it around. It's meant to be interpreted. It's meant to sort of, we have to project a kind of creative reading on top of it so we can figure out how it works. In the same way we'd have to think about, let's say, the furniture in the drawing in Robin Evans' article. So you can see this one even more. This is both simultaneously a seat and then also an armrest. And there's nothing that you couldn't actually build this thing as it is. You would have to begin to invent processes to sort of first interpret and then actually model it so that you could construct it. And these are just a couple other ones. So this idea of sort of a piece of furniture that is confused or has more than one surface or more than one home is something that was sort of put into this project. So the Murphy bed, like I said, takes that a little bit further. So if the Murphy bed belongs both to the floor and to the wall, this house is conceived of as having something like 2 floors, and then that game is played out in the developed surface drawing. So the connection between the molding and the light switches in some cases are oriented to, say, let's say 1 floor, which is actually a wall, or another floor, or a window in this case is rotated around. And this is the actual model. So here's the model of the Murphy bed. And you can begin to see, again, the outlets are all built and they're oriented in different ways. I feel like I was supposed to say something else about this. Anyway, then you can see here the monitor, the conduit, which in this case is oriented towards this, which is 1 wall, and here's the Murphy bed that folds and unfolds. And so this is a photograph of the model with, it's sort of a house with 2 grounds. And so because of this, it has to begin to take on not only the sort of orientation of molding and the orientation of outlets, but also things like windows, or you'll see in there that there's a kind of door here which functions as a trap door at its normal orientation, but in its kind of otherworldly state, it's rotated and it produces a kind of entrance through the basically light frame construction of the floor. And one of the things that's, I think, been nice about this project is we built the model before. So they actually just poured the foundation for this little house on Friday. And so the model itself kind of inverts our own inversion. And little things that become important in the model, like the placement of the hinges so the wall can fold down in the model, begin to function as a kind of reveal in the house itself. So these things begin to kind of, not just the orientation, let's say, of the windows or of the outlets, but also begin to find their way in things that are familiar in the way in which we would think about a reveal in a kind of gallery floor, but find themselves in what's essentially a 1-room shack in someone's backyard in Echo Park. So you can see that here, the hinge, and then the kind of reveal detail, and what will actually function as the front door to this house.
The final project, the shotgun house, it's a kind of, I guess it's a kind of serious way to end this. So the shotgun house is the 3rd model on display, and we're not showing the entire house. We're just showing a kind of moment in this project. Originally, there was a competition in Lexington, Kentucky, where we were asked to rethink the interior of a shotgun house, which is a kind of typical southern house type, where 4 or 5 rooms are built in enfilade, in a kind of plan where there are no hallways, so you literally walk from the living room through the bedroom into the kitchen to the back space. And the prompt was to design this interior for an artist who sometimes has an open house and shows off the interior as a kind of gallery space, and sometimes is simply living inside with his family. So we recognize the fact that there is another type of plan that acts just like the shotgun house, which is a regular palace plan, or the enfilade plan of a gallery or a museum. And since the brief asked for both, it just seemed natural to make more of it, not less. So what we tried to do is basically place this kind of enfilade palace plan into the skinny shotgun house. And what happened was a kind of, instead of 4 rooms, you get 8 rooms. Instead of 3 walls, we got 4 walls because we added this kind of longitudinal wall. And instead of having 5 doors, we had 18 doors. Now, so you can move from one space into the next, and each room had 4 ways of going in and out of. It seemed redundant, let's say, to build 18 doors and 18 doors that operated each opening in the space. But it was important to us that sometimes you could have a kind of closed house that acted as a shotgun house. So you would literally have 4 rooms and maybe a kind of closet behind a freestanding wall. Or sometimes you could have an open house and kind of move all the doors out of the way to produce a kind of literal enfilade through this thing. So instead of building 18 doors, we realized we needed each door to kind of double in its door frame. Now, clearly there is a precedent for this. We didn't come up with this idea. The precedent is from Marcel Duchamp, and he asked the carpenter to build one of these doors. And the door simply asks the question, is the room open, or is the door open, or is the door closed? And it was enough for this art object to simply ask this kind of, let's say, philosophical question. And when we came into this as architects, we wanted to kind of transition, let's say, the kind of ready-made into something that could operate in the architectural discipline. And the way we thought about it was through the details. So what would be the kinds of details? They had to correspond to shotgun house construction. So in this case, it's a kind of vernacular interior with molding, yet again, with conduit, once again, with kind of 2x4s, structural pieces. And to make it kind of more interesting, we combined 2 Duchamp doors back to back. So it's actually a double door frame that's mirrored on itself to produce a kind of variety of detail. So you see our rendering on the right. And the detail became really important. So you could actually kind of plan the way in which this would be built. And that became a kind of important drawing, a drawing of construction. And so you can see that if we were to draw it at first, it would be a simple intersection of 2 walls. But having kind of designed the way the molding turns the corner and the way in which, let's say, the 2x4s are acting the kind of structural way, it displaced the central wall into 2 different paths, right? So like the way in which the intersection comes together had to displace the center into 2 parts. So the detail of the plan begins to look like this, where whereas in the beginning all rooms had the same square footage, were all split into even 4 parts. The displacement of some of these walls produced hierarchies on the interior of the plan. So you can kind of see that the second room is much larger than the first, right? So like some of these details produced repercussions in the overall plan of the house, which we found really interesting. And then, when we started thinking about the details, we had to figure out how to combine the ornaments that would have normally surrounded one door frame into something that combined 2 into one image. So here you see a couple of axiometric drawings where the molding begins to turn the corner or begins to combine the door frames into one object. And here again, in a kind of vertical space. So this is the final image, and really just to kind of begin to think about the role that the model plays in our work. It seems to us a kind of appropriate way to maybe end on this, because of course the topic is authenticity, and this is maybe our interpretation of a model that of course already exists out there in the world, but we were thinking about it more specifically through architectural terms, and hoping that kind of brought our own authorship into a kind of problem that maybe we all share.
That's it.
That's it. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.